Good afternoon, hello everyone, and welcome from the NASPA office in Washington, D.C. I hope everyone is enjoying their Careers in Student Affairs Month this October. My name is Jasmine Scott, and I'm the Assistant Director of Member Engagement working with student and youth professional initiatives at NASPA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's SAZAM webinar, The Current State of Student Affairs Looking Toward the Future with NASPA President Dr. Kevin Kruger and the NASPA Board Chair Dr. Deb Moriarty. Before we get started with our formal presentation, I do want to review some technical aspects of today's program. So before we begin, if you can minimize all other applications, that will kind of help keep things as smooth as possible. The webinar will last about 60 minutes and we'll save some time at the end to answer any of your questions. You should currently be able to hear my voice using your phone or computer speakers and view a PowerPoint slide on your screen. On your screen, you should also see a gray menu, likely on your right-hand side. That will allow you to access the audio control panel. And you can dial in either through your phone, if you're in your office and you have a phone, or through your computer speakers. We'll also be asking you to send in questions throughout the presentation, so please use the question or comment box. That's also located in that same gray panel towards the bottom of the screen, and we'll get back to you either throughout the presentation or again, we'll save some time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. In the case that the menu is getting in your way, if you want to see the screen better, or you still have some applications up, you can hide it at any point by using the orange arrow at the very top of the vertical strip of icons that hangs there on the side of your menu. You'll want to use that and pop it back open to ask any questions throughout the presentation. And finally, for those of you who may be tweeting along with us, please use our hashtag for Careers in Student Affairs Month, which is hashtag CSAM17. And now I will turn this over to Dr. Kruger and Dr. Moriarty.
Thank you, Jasmine. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have everybody here today for this program. This is an annual tradition where we have a chance to hear, for myself as the president of NASPA and the current board chair, to have some dialogue with you about some of the issues we're seeing and a little bit about what's going on from our standpoint in student affairs and higher education. So, Deb, why don't you start off and just introduce yourself and a little bit about your background. Maybe, I think people will be really interested in hearing a little bit about how it is you got to be both board chair and also a little bit about your career.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. So again, I'm Deb Moriarty, and I'm currently the Vice President for Student Affairs at Towson University, which is part of the University System of Maryland, just outside of Baltimore. I've been in that position for about 14 years now. And I would say that, I just spoke last week at a Careers in Student Affairs conference here in the Baltimore area. I would say that I have a fairly non-traditional path on the way to being a Vice President for Student Affairs, though I knew early in my career that I wanted to be a Vice President for Student Affairs. I knew that partly because I realized that in order to be able to really affect change, that while we have hierarchical leadership, you pretty much have to be in a position in the hierarchy to have the kind of authority and voice to be able to impact change. So I decided that pretty early on that I wanted to do that. And again, my path here was fairly non-traditional. Prior to becoming the vice president, I was an associate VP at UMBC, which was the traditional training that I had for becoming a vice president. Prior to that, I had been at both the University of Michigan and the University of California, Los Angeles, but more in staff roles, advising student groups, coordinating special projects. So I specialized in leadership education, and throughout my whole career, I've been intimately involved in work with professional associations, which I firmly believe is how I got to the position to get into the role as Vice President for Student Affairs. It was through a lot of that work that was giving me more of those traditional skills that employers are looking for. Team building and staff/volunteer management and managing budgets and, planning and developing strategic plans, those kinds of things.
So Deb, did you, I'm just curious, I don't know if I've asked you this before, did you start off as an undergraduate? Did you get interested in student affairs through a traditional role? Were you an RA or an orientation advisor? How did you what was the bug that got you kind of connected?
Yeah, it's interesting, Kevin. I was an RA and I was a very involved student, but I was also a recreation and leisure education major, which I had really focused on, I sort of had looked at all aspects of recreation parks and recs and, rehabilitation recs. And my work experiences had been in commercial recreation. So either the YMCA or working and helping to run marinas. And when I found out, based on my philosophy around recreation and how one uses free time, and the fact that I learned my senior year that you could do the kind of co-curricular stuff that I was doing as an undergraduate as a career, I immediately realized that I had found my passion and my path.
Yeah, that strikes me. One of the things that's really different about today, I mean, even given this program and the fact that we had a program up in Maryland around careers in student affairs that didn't exist when we were coming up. We kind of had to stumble on the field, and it was not something that a lot of people had known about. And that was kind of my experience. I was an RA also. Had planned on being a social studies teacher of all things in 10th grade, a 10th grade social studies teacher. And once I realized that I really didn't want to teach 10th grade social studies, I was sort of adrift a little bit in my senior year until my hall director said that there was this whole career called student affairs. And so I think, even though same thing for me, didn't start off with this as an idea of my career, I think it kind of evolved that way. So,
and I think even today, young professionals are still not figuring out that you can do this. It's like their junior or senior year, a light bulb goes off, or even where I am, graduate students will come in and will do assistantships in our area, and we don't have a student affairs program at Towson University. And in that process of having this experience, they'll still decide, wow, this is a really great way to, educate students and have an influence on the educational process, and will decide even in graduate school.
Again, listening to you talk, I recall, so just a quick my background, I did my master's work at the University of Maryland, College Park, and one of my very first internships, I was with the vice president of student affairs at Maryland, and it really was from that moment that I like that's the job I want. I want to be a vice president of student affairs, and so I spent most of the first 10, 15 years of my career really trying to create experiences that would help me be competitive to be a vice president. And as you know, and I'll tell the audience that I started off in student affairs, and but then had an opportunity to come work at NASPA back in quite a while ago. And at that point, I thought, well, I'd come to work at NASPA for a couple of years, and this would be an opportunity to kind of get a national perspective on higher education issues. And at that time, said I would do that for about 2 years, and that was 1984, and I'm now in my 23rd year at NASPA, so you can see how that worked out. As Deb, as you know, but I'll tell the audience that I have worked at NASPA for 23 years, and then for the last 6 have been the president and CEO of NASPA, and I get the pleasure to work with a really talented board of directors, and which Deb leads. And Deb, maybe you can share a little bit about the governance structure of NASPA. It's just since a lot of the undergraduate students here may not have a sense of how it is we are organized, and a little bit about how we're set up and what your role is as board chair.
Okay. So I think that Kevin has been a part of, Kevin's been a part of the leadership of NASPA for a long time, but when we transitioned to Kevin as president, it was at a time that the organization was really thinking pretty seriously about, how do we professionalize ourselves a little bit more. I think student affairs people, there has been a history of feeling like second-class citizens, or we're not good enough, or we don't really contribute to the educational experience, even though those of us who do this work know that's true. And so I think that, Kevin, the way that you have reshaped NASPA has really helped us be taken much more seriously, not only within our institutions, but in the field of education in general, about how important the co-curricular experience is. So NASPA really has been built on a foundation of volunteerism. And so even as the organization has become more professionalized, if you will, there's a great marriage between the professional staff, the innovation and the creativity and the work that they're doing to enhance the field, and the volunteers who support that work, enhance that work, or contribute to that work. So the board of directors really in some ways is similar to the board of directors that exists within university structures. We are big picture thinking. We try to guide the organization in terms of policy development. But the board is really made up of senior volunteers throughout the organization. So folks who are regional directors, folks who are directors of divisions. I think that even since I started in the role as chair-elect, and I think I'm pretty knowledgeable about NASPA, I'm astounded at the number of volunteer opportunities there are for people to get started, get your foot in the door, and then determine which way, if you do want to work your way up the organization. So I think there's lots and lots of opportunity for that.
Well, it's a talented board, and I think, we have I think one of the things on our agenda is how do we address, the prepare the student affairs professionals for the changes that are happening in higher education. And Debbie, you mentioned, you've been a vice president for 14 years and, been in the field for a while also. Maybe let's just dig into some of the changes we're seeing, and can you share a little bit about what you see as how student affairs in your role has shifted, maybe within the last 10 years? What are some of the things that you see as higher priorities maybe today than maybe they were 10 years ago?
Well, I think the first one that comes to mind for me is that within the past 10 years, I've seen our work move from being our work to being everybody's work. So as there has been an influx of legislation and concern about some of the really significant issues that we have dealt with forever on our campuses, student behavior and sexual assault and alcohol and all of those topics that are a little bit very messy, but also we often use as an educational opportunity. I'll never forget when our vice president for communication came back to campus about 8 years ago and said to me, "Did you know that sexual assault is going to be a big issue?" And so the legal counsel and the vice presidents for communication were thinking about it. And all of a sudden, our work became everybody's business, which I think is good in some ways because more minds make for sometimes better decisions. But it makes it a little bit more challenging because it sometimes feels like our expertise might be being questioned. So I think that's one of the big ones. And I think presidents also are, presidents are really, what am I trying to say? I think that the reputation of the institution is so tied into the president, and it can be so easily marred by somebody within the institution just doing something that doesn't make any sense but gets into the media, and all of a sudden the president's responsible. So I think presidents, based on the proliferation of media and access to media, are very, very image conscious. So they too want to hold this a little bit closer to make sure they know exactly what's going on and how it's being done, and sometimes even trying to influence some of the decisions that we have to make. I think the other huge change, well, two other huge changes that I would talk about. One is, and I think you probably see this more acutely in the coastal areas or the borderline states than you do in the middle of the country right now, but we are becoming a truly diverse United States population. And more and more our population for coming to college is going to be first-generation low-income students. And it's not necessarily a population that we have done a very good job with. And so I think that there's a real imperative for us to figure out how do we support students that come from, either they're the first one in their family to go to college and perhaps their parents don't even speak English. And with the cost of education, the income can be a real barrier. I think we have to really put some systems and structures and supports in place to help support students from those backgrounds. And the third thing I would say is just the cost that, I have always worked in public education, and from the time I started till now, the amount of funding that public education gets from the state has really radically changed. And so people are critical of how expensive it has become to go to a public college or university. The reality is that historically the states contributed much more to that, and now it's really being built on the back of tuition dollars and fees. And so I think that, I talk to my staff a lot about we're not likely to see lots of new revenue coming in, and so I think it's an imperative to really think about what are the collaborations, the efficiencies, how do we combine things so that we're continue to provide that excellent service and support for students, because I think people do accept the fact that this, both the supports that we provide outside of the classroom from mental health to disability support to career advising, as well as the engagement pieces, are really an important part of the educational package. And so figuring out how to contain costs, I think, is going to become increasingly critical as the cost becomes unmanageable for many students that are interested.
I think you're spot on. You're right. Yeah, I think your comment about the changing demographics of higher education are probably the most, maybe in some cases, the most relevant for new professionals coming into the field. And we are going to see more low-income students attending college, which is a great thing. Given the dynamics of our country, with significant increases in Hispanic Latino youth coming to college, those students are disproportionately low income and first generation. I think about 75% of the Hispanic Latino students coming to college now are from families who there's no college experience. And so what we know, and I think you've identified this, Deb, is that the persistence and completion rates for first generation students, low income students, Hispanic Latino students, and African American students in particular is significantly behind their peers. So I think it creates a challenge for us, and I think one that's an important one for our nation, really. How do we develop systems and supports that can increase that degree persistence rate for many students who have not completed at a rate we would be happy with in our country. So I think that increasingly is going to be a part of the student affairs work, is how do we intersect with those students in different kinds of ways. One of the things we've learned over the years is that individual contact, coaching, and mentoring, for example, makes a big difference in persistence and completion for students. And so I think one of the things we're going to see more of is in the role that student affairs professionals play, I think, is in that coaching mentoring space. And we've been doing that kind of, in many cases, we're almost trained to do that. But I think I see a time when we'll be doing this in a much more deliberate, more intentional way with targeted populations. In fact, I've often said I think I can see a time when many, if not most, student affairs professionals will have a cohort of low-income first-gen students that they're working with to help guide them through some of the challenges and ultimately increase degree completion. So I think that's going to be an important part of the student affairs world. There's a lot of, this is not just a student affairs issue, and I really like what you said earlier, that our issues are everyone's issues. And I think all of higher education, I think, really now is sort of orienting itself around trying to find, evidence-based, effective practices that can improve degree completion for those students. And so we'll be working aside academic affairs and the advising center and the tutoring center and a whole bunch of other functions that exist on campus. I think we're going to see a lot more cross-functional work in that area going forward. So I think you're onto something there. I think it's really, really important.
Can I add to that, Kevin?
Yeah, sure.
One of the things that's on my list is that, I think that our work related to inclusion, diversity, and equity is we are just scratching the surface. And my experience is that student affairs people are better than others on campus in this because it's been part of our training and education and part of our growing up with an interest in the field, but we're not perfect at it. And so I think that our own personal identity work is critical, and I would say especially for young professionals who are coming in, because as we have increasingly diverse population, the ability to understand and have compassion and not look through biased lenses as we're creating programs and support systems is going to be critical to that student success. And oftentimes we are then in a position to help educate others on the campus around this. That I think that most student affairs divisions are probably physically more diverse than other campuses and do much more training and development within the context of their work on the university. And that's not necessarily true in the administration and finance ranks or even academic affairs. So I think there are some opportunities for us, but I think we need to understand it and know it first.
Deb, I think you're right. One of the places where I think this is, on today's campus is really coming to a head is the intersection that we're seeing around issues of racial injustice and issues of different perspectives on oppression, Black Lives Matter, all of which is kind of, is present on our campus with this sort of trend towards some increasing number of speakers who are getting brought to campus who maybe have sort of a bent towards having more sort of hate speech or far right perspectives, even white supremacists coming to our campus. I think it's creating a lot of challenges for student affairs as we kind of manage the dialogue between with students on campus. Do you have any thoughts about like where we're heading with this and what you think some of the priorities should be for student affairs?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Kevin. And really, the note I wrote on my pad as you were saying that is, the complexity of free speech. I mean, I think free speech issues have always been complex, but I think they have become more complex as we have become more diverse. And so I think really grappling with issues around free speech. But I think the foundation for that has to be, how do we continue to create opportunities for conversations where differences can be identified and discussed in a way that's not just a nasty tweet on Instagram or Twitter or, I find the proliferation of social media makes it much more challenging to have those thoughtful, meaningful conversations. And it's really harder sometimes to get students together to do that. So I think figuring out ways in the graduate preparation program to what are the skills that we need to facilitate those kind of discussions, and then how do we experience those discussions, and then how do you introduce them into your campus, and how do we help faculty? Again, faculty don't like the word training, but I think how can we help faculty build the skills that they need to really be effective as their world around them changes? And so I think and I hope that we'll be called on more and more to be part of the discussion with faculty about how do you create these conversations within the classroom, because if we could have them happen in the classroom, the co-curricular piece would be really enhanced also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no doubt that we one of our, I think, most significant opportunities and challenges is going to be how do we increase these environments where dialogue can occur, because that's really, that's the hope for our society if you think about it. I mean, and even among if you look at our federal government, among our Congress is a great example where we're having a very hard time talking across differences and finding common ground. So I think that's one opportunity. I think at the extremes though, and I think we're just seeing so much more extremes now on campus, and in our society, I think it creates some unique challenges. There's some survey research that suggests that more and more college students today think that the government actually should restrict free speech because of some of the, really far out there kind of hate speech that's out there. And yet, we're in a position as administrators sometimes of having to permit even some of the most abhorrent speech, even, things that we would, ourselves be opposed to for the principle of free speech. How do you resolve that, Deb? How do you make sense of that with students?
It's extremely challenging, and I think that I'm appreciative, and one of my approaches as a vice president is I'm a vice president because I really like working with students and like the developmental aspects of it, and I feel like the relationships that I have built with students leading into a point in time when we started having conflict on campus helped me immensely. And so I don't think that we can be administrators who sit in our office. I think having those relationships with students and figuring out where those hot spots are going to be, and being able to have, reasonable conversations and, seeking to understand, even though some of it seems kind of incomprehensible. I remember when I was at UCLA, UCLA has a huge rivalry with USC. And that was, a long time ago. And even then I remember thinking, these rivalries are teaching us to hate people who are different from us just because of the school that they go to and just because of their mascot. And it might seem like a really silly example, but I think that, in a society that's set up sort of as a competition, I mean, you watch it throughout sports all the time. People hate people from other schools just because they like the other school. And And so I think that some of these structural things that are so historic, we have to start breaking that down a little bit. And again, I think healthy competition is good, but the kind of hatred that I've seen towards others just because of who they identify with really feels like a microcosm for bigger issues in our society.
Well, I think, it comes as no surprise. I think that this issue around activism, protests, disruption of speech on campus, I think, is the issue of the year. I think we're really going to be sorting this out in higher education, and we're under a little bit of a microscope because I think that there are those from the outside who think that higher education is really sort of a liberal bastion, and that we kind of restrict or don't allow for alternative viewpoints. And I think so a lot of the actions that we're going to take in this year are going to be viewed very, very carefully by our states, even by the federal government, as we've seen so far. I think 23 states now have legislation pending that would prohibit any kind of restriction of speech on a college campus, including having free speech zones and those kinds of things. So I think we're moving into a much more heavily regulated space around free speech, which is certainly going to make this work more difficult. But this is clearly a top 2 or 3 issue. Deb, let me pivot and raise another top issue. I was at a meeting last week with a college president from Tulane University with a group of vice presidents for student affairs, and he asked the group, well, what do you think is the most significant issue facing student affairs? And to a person, they all identified the evolving mental health challenges on campus as one of the biggest issues. And what if you could comment on a little bit about what that is meaning now for the different kind of work that we do in student affairs as we try to meet the really varied and complex mental health needs of our students?
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly has added, another layer of complexity. Again, student affairs historically have worked with the counseling centers and the disability support areas to provide support for students that need it, but it really does seem to be growing in some ways exponentially at this point. And so as access to college opens up for students who 20, 30 years ago might not have gone, I do think it creates quite a bit of complexity. And in a time when we have diminishing resources, I have found that most of our new resources go into either the counseling center or disability support services, just so that we have places for students to go that need help. I think it has changed the way that we train our resident advisors and prepare them for dealing with some of the challenges. And even more recently, I now hear faculty saying, and we have a lot of adjunct faculty on our campus, and I'm not sure it's disproportionate with adjunct, but they don't have the same time on campus and relationship with students. I'm not really sure that research faculty do either, other than maybe within the context of their classroom. But we get calls from faculty more frequent than I would like to admit about, I'm worried about this student, I'm afraid of this student, I need you to, have a conversation with the student, or I need to get them out of the class. And so some of it has been really working with faculty to figure out, how do you talk to a student, which it seems silly that we have to do this, but really when you're dealing with the care of students, and part of the care is thinking about what might their needs be in a crisis. I think really helping faculty understand, one, that we're go-to people for them, but two, there are some basic skills that they can use as they're navigating with students who might be disruptive in the class, or who they might physically be having a visceral reaction and saying, I don't feel safe with this student here. So there's lots more, I'm seeing a lot more interplay between faculty and student affairs professionals on this, and not always in the most positive of way, quite honestly.
Well, I think faculty sometimes feel a little out of their element on this issue, and yet at the same time, we really need. This is a true takes a village kind of issue. We need a lot of folks supporting our students, as and identifying students who are really struggling or in trouble psychologically. And so faculty are sometimes have the best vantage point from which to identify mental health issues. A student who maybe starts missing class, a student who had A's at one point and suddenly is turning in D work, students who maybe write about something that's happening in their life in an essay. So having faculty connected to the resources in student affairs, I think, is really, really critical. It brings me to a thought. When I ask you, so one of the outcomes of all this for student affairs has been really some new jobs that have come around. We're seeing more case managers, for example, and social workers being hired in student affairs because of some of the more complex issues that are coming up in relationships to the mental health concerns that students are bringing. And I guess which makes me brings me a question I'm wondering about as you think, as we're talking to a group who are thinking about moving into student affairs. What would you say are some of the critical skills that are more important today or going forward than we've had before? So as folks are thinking about constructing experiences in their career, what kinds of things should they be? What kind of skills should they be taking on that will be really relevant for this next 5-10 years?
That's such a good question, and you're absolutely right about the notion of case managers. If before I answer that question, I could just mention, as I started by saying that our work is everybody's business, it sometimes feels like they only want to be in it to tell us how to do it, and I think it has to work both ways. That our work should be everybody's business in terms of being able to have critical conversations with students. And I think about presidents who have gone down because they've mismanaged student protests on campus. And in some ways, it feels like there's a fear of having a conversation with a student. And so I don't think that can be just student affairs work. I think we have to be able to help others figure out how to have complex and controversial conversations. So I think our ability to listen and articulate and communicate is always going to be important. I think knowing, I'm a firm believer that as a leader, your best skill is your self-knowledge, like who am I, what am I good at, what do I like doing, and then how do I build teams around me, whether that's people that actually report to you or people that you work with who complement those skills as we start dealing with some complex issues. I think so much of it's just ambiguity, right? Not being very linear in your thinking, but learning how to be comfortable with, well, it might be this way one day, but the next day it might be something else. These don't feel like very concrete skills in some ways, but I certainly think intercultural competence is critical. I think the ability to address conflict, not necessarily manage conflict, but address it, that you can do that without a fear of what somebody might think or say. Early in my profession, I just remember people saying all the time, you have to have thick skin to do this, you have to have thick skin. And certainly I think over the years your skin gets thicker, but it doesn't mean that you have to lose your empathy or care and concern for students. I think crisis management, I don't know how much grad preparation programs are helping students understand the strategies for, if there was a fire in your residence hall, for example, again, that's going to be everybody's business on campus, but we're the ones that are in those residence halls. And so how do you manage crises, whether it's, a fire, a weather emergency, a student death? I think knowing and accepting that bad things are going to happen on one of the campuses you're on at some point in your life is really an important thing to start practicing and thinking about early in your career. What other skills would you add, Kevin?
I like all those. I would add just a couple, some maybe more, a couple kind of practical things. I think assessment increasingly and understanding of data is going to be more and more important. I think as we look at the next 5 to 10 years, the fiscal condition of higher education is going to be really challenged. The cost of higher education has been such that we know we're going to have very little flexibility to raise tuition, and you've seen that within the University of Maryland system or fees, but costs keep going up, and so we're going to be in a very constrained fiscal environment, I think, for the near future, in the foreseeable future, and so in that regard, I think one of the things student affairs will have to do is continue to demonstrate the value of what it does and through data. So data analytics, assessment skills, I think are going to be critical, because then we can tell the story about the impact of things like student organizations or leadership experiences, or or internships, or on-campus work and employment, or other things that we may be engaged in, or other engagement activities that students are participating in. So I think that's going to be more and more important. I think I love your, a little bit echo your comment about intercultural skills. I think our campuses are, just from an identity standpoint, are becoming so complex and rich, which is fantastic, because it gives students the opportunity then to interact with a whole range of people that they might not otherwise have interacted with from their home, potentially. But I think that same competence is going to be necessary for student affairs professionals. And you mentioned sort of knowing yourself and identifying your own identities, I think is part of that. And then an understanding of the complexity of identities that are presented in the students we work with, I think is going to be really, really critical. I would add to that, anything, again, kind of picking up on the finance thread, anything around dollars. As you think about, as the folks on this call think about entering a grad program and maybe getting a graduate assistantship, anywhere you can find some budgetary experience, I think will be important, because that's a skill that isn't always widely found within higher education. Learn how to construct a budget, and use a budget, and I think will be important. And then along the way also, and any kind of opportunity you have to pick up something around fundraising. Increasingly, fundraising is now more a core part of student affairs. As resources are tight, that may be one way that new dollars can come into a division of student affairs. And it can be something it can be anything from grant writing to literally something as simple as going down to your college town and asking for donations for a program. But the ability to ask for money, to raise money, I think is another sort of skill set, I think, that will be more important. And I think the last thing is just, which we've kind of touched on, and is this focus on student success, having an understanding of why it is that students succeed, where some of the barriers are to success, and how we can develop programs to address that. I think those increasingly are going to be important. And with that will be the skill set of how to work across functional lines with institutional research, with people from technology, from people from academic affairs. That I think increasingly we cannot be a silo. We have to be able to work across functional areas to achieve a more or a broader or more common goal. So those are some things that come to mind for me. Let me ask maybe one more final question. We can see if we have any questions from the audience. Deb, you mentioned earlier in your introductions about professional associations and how important that was for you. I couldn't agree more, but can you just dig in a little bit more about why, as these young folks are thinking about entering the field, why getting involved in a professional association is so important, what the value it brings?
I would say that there are two primary values. One is it can really provide you an opportunity to learn skills that you might not be learning in your entry-level or mid-level position. So as a new professional out at UCLA, I was involved in helping to create a region for an association that was really very job-specific. I was in student activities, and so the National Association of Campus Activities was where I put my early energy. And so I was able to really get some hands-on experience in my own skill building that has served me well. And the other thing I think is just simply the networking, that I can't think of a time that I've been to a professional conference, and I've probably been to one almost every year of my professional life, where meeting people, knowing people, I mean, I have friends that are really conference friends that I see once a year, but once a year for 20 years really makes for quite a relationship, and they become a safe place to talk, to vet ideas, to, maybe complain about what's going on in your job. And I think I almost always have walked away feeling better about that. So I think the networking, you just never know when somebody's going to come back in your life. So one of the pieces of advice that I really like to give to younger professionals is just don't burn bridges. You know, I don't really think it matters if you're in a horrible work situation or you've had a horrible experience working with a volunteer and a volunteer. You know, just remain neutral, because you just never know. It's a much smaller profession than it seems, and you never know when those people are going to come back in your life. And there, you know, there comes a point. I think that it's not unusual for younger professionals to be topically specific in their alignment with the professional association. You know, I think for me, there came a point in my career where, as I broadened my areas of interest in terms of the kind of work that I wanted to do, I needed an association like NASPA to give me more of that breadth. And knowing that I wanted to be a vice president, I thought, let's be in an association where lots of vice presidents are, so I can learn more about that and really help to further assess whether or not it was a good fit for me to think about doing this down the road.
Well, I'd echo your comments. I think and all the research suggests, not even for student affairs, but in general, that networking is the number one kind of outcome people look for getting involved professionally, no matter what your profession is. And you know, and I would just add to that the practice of what we do continues to evolve. That we have more research, more evidence about the most effective ways in which to work with students. And so, one of the things a professional association can do is keep you completely up to date in terms of what the current trends are and issues, which will simply make you better at your job. So I think that's that and the networking, I think, are really critical. So, well, Deb, thank you. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to do this. We always enjoy the opportunity to chat with folks who are thinking about the field. I know that we'll hope that some of you who end up in grad school in a year or so will find your way to a NASPA conference at some point. I hope you'll reach out to us and indicate that you were on that webinar back then. But Jasmine, are there any questions that have come in from the group or that we might want to tackle before we close?
Sure. So we do have one question from Luciano. This was sent in while we're talking about mental health interventions on campus and how that's become kind of a pressing issue for professionals. The question was, how do you think that primary interventions like early alerts, slippery slopes, red flags are evolving with the increased prevalence of issues of mental health within post-secondary populations?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that one of the things that Kevin talked about, which is sort of the influx of case managers, you know, we've been working with behavioral intervention teams for a while. We started one quite a while ago at Towson University because you know that a student in crisis likely is not just showing up in one place. So having the right people around the table, our team meets once a week, and we have been able to really intervene with a student that we knew was in trouble because they were showing up in trouble in housing, and then they were showing up in trouble in the classroom, and then you can look at their grades, and Kevin, as you say, you know, you're going to see that they went from being a straight A student to the last semester having failed a class, for example. And so I think that the early alerts and early warnings are really critical to us helping, and more often than not, we get those students some of the help that they need, even if it means a break from the college experience, but come back grateful that, you know, we were able to provide that support in a time when it was needed. I would say that we pretty much err on the side of being overly cautious about this. You know, we transport students to the hospital on a fairly regular basis for mental health concerns, and we have systems in place for how we're going to interact with that student about the ways that they need to, the ways that they can come back into campus. That it's just, you know, if you're having a mental health issue and you're not addressing that, we're not going to let you just come back onto campus. So really having some good system structures and staff in place that can provide that kind of support is critical.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to echo that, you know, the early intervention is so a key piece of the ecosystem of how we deal with these issues. And, you know, and one of the things that we know is that, you know, for a student who's struggling with anxiety or depression or any other range of issues, to get them into a therapeutic environment has a huge payoff. I mean, therapy works. So for students who are experiencing depression or anxiety, to get them into the counseling center, you know, there's a high chance and a high likelihood that we can get that student back to being a place where they can succeed academically. So it's identifying those students early that is really critical. Again, it gets back to the thing we talked about before, involvement of faculty, why every student affairs professional is important, not just the ones in the counseling center to identify students who are struggling with a variety of issues. So yeah, really good question. Really good question. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for spending some time with us. Deb, thanks for spending time this afternoon, and we wish you the best in your career. I'll tell you that Deb and I will both echo the same thing, that we often think of student affairs as noble work. It is you're really giving of yourself, and we all share sort of a common thread here, and that we really care about the safety, health, and success of our students. And it is a great profession, and I look forward to welcoming all of you who are thinking of coming into this field, into the field. It's a great career. So thank you all very much. Jasmine, thank you so much for hosting this, and you all have a great day.
Thanks.